Okay, so I believe we have started already. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start my presentation right now. So you should be seeing it right now. Okay, so again, good afternoon. My name is Crespo from the University of Porto in Portugal. And today I will be telling you about ultrashort pulses. So these pulses are generated from lasers, and I will give a brief overview of how you can generate them and also how you can measure and control them, because this is vital for applications to be able to use these laser pulses in biomedical applications and other applications which take advantage of their unique properties. So before I begin, just a brief description about of our research group and work in Porto. So as I mentioned, we are based in Porto, the city of Porto, at the Department of Physics and Astronomy. This is the Faculty of Sciences. And most of our work done in Portugal is based on this Ultrafast lab that we call FemtoLab. And we have been mostly devoted to two things. So on one hand, the development of new sources, new light sources based on lasers, capable of generating pulses with unique characteristics. And this is also intimately related to their measurement and control. So you cannot really separate generation from measurement and control. So that's one of the things we have been doing. And at the same time, we have been applying these pulses to different fields, ranging from ultrafast spectroscopy to photonics in promising materials like graphene. And also, more recently, we have been devoting some of our time and lasers to biomedical imaging, namely nonlinear microscopy of cells and other systems. So maybe it would be a good idea to tell you a bit about what an ultrashort light pulse is. So this is a simplified depiction, and this is essentially something that occurs in time and corresponds to an oscillation of the electric field. So you have a fast oscillating electric field. That's a light pulse. And it's a pulse because you only have a few oscillations of this very fast field. And the period of this oscillation is really small, around 2.5 femtoseconds. So 1 femtosecond is 10 to the minus 15 seconds. So that's 0.14 zeros 1 second. And it's so short that you cannot really observe this kind of phenomenon using standard electronics. You would need a petahertz oscilloscope, which is 1 million times faster than the fastest oscilloscopes you can get, which operate at gigahertz. So forget about using normal optoelectronics or electronics to observe these pulses directly. So these pulses are produced in a special kind of laser that we call the mode-locked laser. They have high peak powers because you're cramming energy, a given amount of energy, in a very small time duration. So the power is high, which is energy divided by time. And because they are so short, these pulses, they also have they allow very high resolution. So you can time resolve dynamics of things like charge carriers in semiconductors, molecular reactions. You can actually track them in real time using these light pulses to look at those events. And these are among the fastest events ever generated and measured in science and technology. So not just the fastest light pulse, but the fastest event ever. So what can you do with these pulses? So because of their unique characteristics, namely the short duration and the high peak powers, you can do many things, like materials processing. You can micro machine materials at really small scales. You can also, as I mentioned previously, do ultra-fast spectroscopy to look at the dynamics, at the real fundamental dynamics of atoms or molecules. And you also have very important applications in biomedical engineering and bioimaging, namely optical coherence tomography that you've heard about already, and femtosecond laser surgery, and multiphoton microscopy. And again, these applications and others are particularly important for this school, because they concern biomedical applications of lasers. So among the many unique properties of ultrashort laser pulses, one of them is the fact that they are so fast, so short in time, that you don't have time for thermal processes to take place. So in other words, you can essentially cut through things without burning, so no thermal side effects. And this is very clear when we look at an image here of a a hole made with a standard laser, a continuous wave laser, which we call CW for short. So a continuous wave laser is always working, so it's a beam, continuous beam, and if you put a material in front of it, you can, of course, drill a hole, but you're going to have a lot of side effects from the thermal effects associated to this interaction. As you decrease, as you start to use laser pulses, and you decrease their duration from nanoseconds to picoseconds and then femtoseconds, so this is 10 to the minus 9 femtoseconds, 10 to the minus 12, so 1,000 times shorter, and finally 10 to the minus 15, so 1 million times shorter than a nanosecond. If you go to the femtosecond scale, you can do something like this, a perfectly machined hole without any thermal effects, okay? So among other things that these pulses can do, and a very important thing, which I will be telling you about very soon, is nonlinear optics. So you can transform, you can change the color of light using these lasers. You can make a red laser become a blue laser, for instance. Among those things, one of them is really the capability of cutting without burning. Okay, and this is a photo from a company which machined their logo on a match head, so without burning the match. So we'll be hearing more about this property in the next talk by Rosa Romero, where she'll be discussing the biomedical applications of ultra-short laser pulses. So using these pulses and actually generating them, in fact, poses a problem. Because whenever you have short pulses, you need, of course, to generate them. You need to have a proper source, a laser capable of generating those pulses. And then you need to manipulate those pulses so that they will behave as you want in a specific experiment. And then you have to measure the pulses in order to make sure that you're doing the right thing and the pulse has not been destroyed somehow. And we will see that it's very easy to destroy these pulses. Now, our approach is based on the following. Historically, it's been incredibly harder and increasingly harder to do this generation, manipulation, and control and measurement. So generating very, very short pulses is hard to do. Keeping them short is hard to do. And making sure that you're measuring them correctly is also hard to do. And again, the harder, the shorter the pulses. And our approach was essentially based on not separating these three aspects. So we don't think of a laser as a source that we put on a side and that's it. And then we have an application on another side, and at the same time, we have in another corner a measuring device. So all of these things, the generation, the application and manipulation, and the measurement have to be looked at together as a whole, because that's the only way for you to be able to really take advantage of the shortest light pulses you can generate today. So I will give now a brief introduction to the process of generating these pulses. So we're going to see what this mode locking I mentioned is all about. So mode locking is a technique for femtosecond pulse generation, and it works by making sure that a specific laser is built in order to operate in a way which is different from a normal laser. And perhaps the most important difference is the fact that a mode locked laser is not emitting a single color, a single wavelength, for instance, red or blue, but is actually operating at many different colors at the same time. So I represent this here by these different ways. The blue wave oscillating fast because it's a high frequency electric field, then the green, the yellow, and finally the red, which has a lower frequency. Now, if a laser is actually working in the mode locked regime, it is capable of emitting not only these 4 colors, which I just showed you here as an example, but many, many more colors. In fact, a laser operating in the mode locking regime can be emitting as many as 1 million different colors at the same time. But then the trick is to make sure that all of these colors are somehow synchronized. And this is what we call mode locking. So by using nonlinear optics, it's possible to make sure that these colors are not oscillating randomly, but they are phase locked. So there is a given instant in time where they all have the same phase. You see here, this is a peak. The green is also a peak. Same for the yellow and same for the red. So if you add all these waves together, waves interfere. You have the superposition principle that tells you that the laser that is working with all of these colors at the same time is going to be firing out the combination, the sum of all these colors. And if we make these waves interfere, because they are waves, they will interfere constructively here, the point where we had this synchronism, and destructively elsewhere. So that's how we get the femtosecond pulse. It's the interference, the temporal interference between waves with different colors, where here, at a specific point in time, you have constructive interference. Okay? Now, these waves, they are infinite. They are monochromatic waves. They'll last forever. So after a while, a bit further down in time, they're going to be again in phase, and you're going to have another pulse. And that's why a mode-locked laser actually fires a train, what we call a train of pulses. Okay? So a sequence of very short pulses in time. Now, an important thing about these pulses is that they will have a lot of power, because you are cramming the energy of your laser into very, very short bursts. You are like compacting the energy in these short bursts. And the shorter the pulse, the higher the power. If you want to get a really, really short pulse, you need to get many, many colors. So the higher the number of colors, the sharpest this peak will be. Okay? So if we denote by n the number of colors, it results from a simple calculation that the gain you have in power, in peak power, compared to the normal laser, so this is the power of the mode-locked laser compared to the power of the normal laser, the same laser, but operating in the standard, in the single frequency mode, if you like, is n, given by the number of modes. So what this means is, if what I said is true, that you can have a laser operating at 1 million colors at the same time, its peak power is going to be 1 million times higher than the same laser if it was running in a continuous wave regime. Okay, so in short, if you take this n equals 1 million, and if you take a relatively modest and typical laser power over 100 milliwatts, I guess that many of you have used lasers, and 100 milliwatts is quite a standard power. Well, if this very same laser is now working in the mode locking regime, its peak power will be 100 kilowatts, so 1 million times more, 1 million times higher. Okay? Now, one of the most important and fundamental aspects in ultra-short pulse lasers is the relationship between pulse duration and spectrum. And this is unavoidable. And if I wanted to summarize the result, it's very simple. It's here on the bottom part of the image. If you want a short pulse in time, forcibly its spectrum, so its spectral content, has to be broad. You need to have a broad spectrum. And this, in fact, makes total sense based on what I just told you. You need many modes, many different colors in order to have a short pulse. And these many different colors will make up a broad spectrum. Okay? So this means that a femtosecond laser pulse is everything but monochromatic. So forget about the definition where people say that lasers are intense and directional and monochromatic. Well, they can be monochromatic if they are continuous lasers. But a pulsed laser, especially one working in the femtosecond regime, will have a broad spectrum, which can in certain situations look like white light to us. So it's so broad that it encompasses most of the visible spectrum of light. So it looks like white light. So again, very important, very fundamental. Short pulse, broad spectrum. And of course, if you have a long pulse in time, you can have a narrow spectrum, no problem. But a short pulse forcibly requires a very broad spectrum in order for it to be able to support this short pulse. Now, things start to get a bit complicated with ultra-short pulses because of this broad spectrum. And I think that you'll understand this well if we look at an analogy that we have with normal light. So most of you may have seen rainbows, which can be produced, for instance, by putting a prism in front of a white light beam. So in this image, we see white light coming here from above. It's crossing a prism, and because of refraction in the prism, you're going to have this separation of colors. So the colors which are more refractive, so in this case it would be blue, okay, we can see it here, it's been more deflected, if you like, more diffracted, and the red less. So we get this spatial rainbow. So a separation in space of the different frequencies that compose this white light beam. Okay, the reason why this happens is because the different colors travel at different speeds inside the glass of the prism. If they all travel at the same speed, you wouldn't see this separation that you see here. So this phenomenon is due to what we call dispersion. And dispersion is very simple to explain. It's simply the dependence of the refractive index on frequency. So in other words, the speed of light inside the material, in this case glass, will depend on the frequency. So blue light will travel slower than red light, which will travel faster inside the prism. Okay? So in short, when we think of space, spatial coordinates, the phenomenon of dispersion produces a spatial rainbow. But now we have something to take into account. Where's the relationship between this and our laser pulse? Well, our laser pulse has a broad spectrum. So it could be this white light beam here, which means that if the pulse crosses the prism, you will have this spatial rainbow too. So different colors of the pulse will be separated along different angles. But there is also another very important thing, which is light is a wave. And what this means, when one thinks of a wave is something where space and time are intimately coupled. Whatever happens in space also happens in time. Okay? So we also have dispersion in time. So what will happen now with an ultrashort pulse, this dispersion in time will be something very important that will affect the pulse, and we will have to control if we want to generate, measure, and use femtosecond laser pulses properly. So what's all this about? What's this all about, this dispersion in time? So we have here from the left an ultrashort laser pulse. So here we go, the fast oscillations of the electric field. Okay, we know that this is, of course, the electric field of light, but if we think of its spectrum, we know this pulse is composed of many different colors. Okay, so far so good. So if we make this pulse cross a dispersive medium, for instance, a simple piece of glass, we know that inside the glass, the different colors will travel at different velocities. So what happens? The blue will separate from the red, okay? Don't forget that this pulse already has a lot of colors. It's got blue, and it's got red, and it's got yellow. So at the output, so after crossing the glass, the colors will be separated in time. So we see here that we get the red first, and then in the end, we get the blue, which is delayed. But what happened to this pulse? The pulse has become longer in time, okay? Because now the colors are spread in time, and it also has reduced its amplitude. So it used to be a sharply peaked pulse. Now it's more smooth. And the more this happens, the smoother the pulse. So I have here a small animation that shows you what happened to the pulse inside the glass. So from this phase to this phase. And we can see here, as the pulse propagates, it becomes less intense. So its amplitude is reducing. And at the same time, it's becoming longer in time. And it's becoming what we call chirped. So red frequencies first, and then the blue colors or blue frequencies after. Okay? So this is what we call then the effect of temporal dispersion. So the dispersion, the fact that different colors travel at different times, has this dramatic consequence in the time domain, which is the pulse gets broadened in time and becomes what we call chirped. So different colors arriving at different times. And this is a temporal rainbow. So it's not like the spatial rainbow I showed you previously, but it's now a rainbow in time, where we see reds coming first and then the blues. So this is a bit of a problem, because if you have a pulse generated from a femtosecond laser, and if you want to use it in an experiment, for instance, by focusing it with a lens or with a microscope objective, those elements have dispersion. So the pulse will be spread in time. And to see how much this can be, I have here another simulation of a femtosecond pulse, which is shown here. So this spike, this is the time domain, is a pulse before it entered a piece of glass, okay? So just for you to have an idea, a 1 centimeter of glass introduces dispersion that we quantify, so this has units, it's units of femtosecond squared, around 500 femtosecond squared. A microscope objective is 10 times worse. So I will show you what happens to the pulse after a piece of glass, and you can imagine what the microscope objective will do. It's going to be 10 times worse. So the pulse initially is very short, around 10 femtoseconds, and as it crosses the glass, its peak power diminishes drastically, and the pulse is essentially diluted. Okay, it becomes so spread in time that its peak power drops dramatically, as you can see here. So this is the peak power, and this is the duration. And the energy is being essentially diluted in time. So the pulse is still there. It's still a laser pulse, but it's not an ultra-short pulse anymore. Okay? So in other words, short pulses are very strong, very intense, very high power, and so on, but they are hard to keep short. So they are very fragile, and one has to take into account this phenomenon of dispersion if one wishes to keep pulses short. So to generate short pulses, you really have to take this into account. And this is a very simple schematic of what a laser looks like, but a laser which has been designed to generate very short pulses. So a laser is composed of 2 mirrors, one mirror here on the left and then another one on the right, and some crystal or some other medium capable of amplifying light. Okay? So a laser is an amplifier, so it has a material which gets energy typically from a normal laser. A normal laser will be the energy source for a femtosecond, an ultra-short pulse laser. And then we are essentially giving the energy to this material that is capable of amplifying light over a very broad bandwidth. And we want this because we want short pulses. So we don't want narrow spectra, we want broad spectra. But at the same time, any medium, any material medium has dispersion. So you cannot imagine that this laser, which is essentially will have a pulse traveling back and forth inside the laser, okay, where at each round trip, we will get some of the energy coming out, and that's the laser output, basically. So one of these mirrors is partially reflecting, so every time the pulse hits this mirror, we get the pulse coming out. Now, unless we have some pulse shortening device inside the laser, the medium itself, because of dispersion, will destroy the pulse. So, in short, if you want to build a laser that is capable of generating a short pulse, you need not only to have a medium and an energy source, but also a device capable of making sure the pulse is short. So in a way to counteract the effects of dispersion, okay? So essentially we're talking about dispersion compensation, as well as having a medium which has the capability to discriminate between continuous wave operation and mode-locked operation. So I won't go into many details here, but I will tell you a bit about how we can compensate for dispersion. So what we just saw is that we have a standard material like a piece of glass, a pulse, which is shown here very nicely, a compressed pulse after crossing the glass will be spread in time due to the effects of dispersion. And it will also have acquired a chirp. Now, it is possible to build special materials, metamaterials we can call them, which are usually composed of different optical elements, like prisms. And if you design a set of prisms in a way like this, where light will cross the prisms and go back, it's relatively easy to see, at least in this schematic, that because of refraction, you see here, the blue light is more refracted than the red. And then here we have a second prism, where the red light is going to be crossing much more of the prism than the blue light. So what we are doing here is having a system where the red light is going to be delayed with respect to the blue. So this system will introduce negative dispersion. So dispersion which has an opposite sign to the standard dispersion of glasses. So by using something like this, which can also be built using a diffraction or a pair of diffraction gratings, you can introduce negative dispersion, so making reds go faster than blues, and thereby canceling the effect of the dispersion from materials like glasses, okay? And that's basically how one manages to keep light pulses short, by using negative dispersion. Now, the most sophisticated way of introducing this negative dispersion nowadays is not by using prisms or gratings, is by using special mirrors, and they are called chirp mirrors, and they are shown here schematically. So in a chirp mirror, which is composed of a very precise set of alternating layers of transparent material. So what happens is if you have white light coming from the right, the blue frequencies will be reflected in these early layers, and the red frequencies will be reflected after. So they will be delayed with respect to the blue. So this kind of mirror introduces negative dispersion, just like a pair of prisms, but in a more controlled and more engineered way, and more precise way. So I will show you now a film that I got from a fantastic website called AtoWorld from the Max Planck Institute in Garching in Germany. And this simple video shows you the effect of these mirrors on a pulse of light. So you see here, the pulse is coming from the right, it's being reflected, and it became a white light pulse. Let's see again. The pulse coming, it's got chirp. You see the red is coming first, and then the blue in the end. And upon reflection, all colors are going to be synchronized in time. So we have this white light compressed pulse. This is like a pancake, a very thin slice of light. And now we see what happens inside the mirror. So as the light penetrates the mirror, the red frequencies go deeper and then back, and the blue frequencies are reflected in the very early stage. So you get this compression of light, okay, by using chirped mirrors. So this technology is the technology of choice to control pulses. And even though it was not used on the very first laser. So the very first Kerr lens mode locked laser, so it's a type of ultrafast laser, which is perhaps the simplest and at the same time the laser which has the highest performance in terms of pulse duration. So it is composed of a cavity, so with one mirror here, and there is also a material here which is a crystal. But to make this laser mode lock, you have to basically in this section put a pair of prisms. So this will introduce negative dispersion, and that's how the very first Kerr lens mode locked laser was done 30 years ago now. So a long time ago already. So if you combine this technology, which is very simple, so inside the laser, at least in principle, of course, there are then engineering aspects which are, of course, very relevant. But conceptually speaking, you have two mirrors, a medium, which amplifies light, and a dispersion compensation system. Those are the basic ingredients for a femtosecond laser system. So if instead of using the prisms, you use chirped mirrors, then you can generate the shortest pulses you can get today from an ultrashort laser oscillator, which is essentially this device. So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. This was a laser designed a few years ago, which is composed of 4 mirrors. And all of these mirrors are chirped mirrors, so they compensate for the dispersion of the crystal. And more recently, using the dscan technique, which is something I will be telling you about in a second, we have been able to generate really short pulses, which were further optimized. And you can actually get spectral, like this spectrum here. So this is wavelength in nanometers. And you see this laser has a really broad spectrum, which is also double peaked. So you have 2 peaks here. Anyway, this was built and optimized using dscan, which is something I will tell you about in a couple of slides. So dispersion is something which appears to be a problem because it stretches your pulse in time, but it can also be used to compress your pulse. And this is actually behind a very important technique, which really was a revolution in laser science and technology and in many other fields which make use of laser, which is the capability of using dispersion to achieve extremely high powers using lasers. Actually, not just using lasers, using anything, because the powers you can have today using lasers are the highest powers of any machine ever and are measured in petawatts. So that's 10 to the 15 watts, okay? Now, the lasers I showed you just now, they are very short. You know, they can deliver pulses with durations of around 5 watts, but they don't have a lot of energy. They are oscillators. So they have typically a few nanojoules of energy. And in order for those lasers to be useful for more things, it's important to amplify them. But you cannot simply amplify them. If you try to increase their energy while keeping their durations short, the peak power will rapidly be so high that the laser itself would be destroyed. So the way to fix this was the following. So this was invented in 1985, and it was really a revolution. So you take a pulse from a oscillator, which is a short pulse with low energy, and then you use dispersion to stretch it in time. So you have a pulse which has a lot of spectrum, but has been diluted in time. And then you amplify this pulse. So you see here, it's amplified now. We have more energy, but the duration is still long. And then you use negative dispersion to make the pulse short again. Okay, and this is called a chirped pulse amplification. You are amplifying a pulse which has been first chirped, okay? And with this, you can achieve petawatt peak powers. And this is such an important technique that it was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics 2 years ago, in 2000, well, almost 3 years ago, 2018, to professors Donna Strickland and Gerard Mourou, okay? So another thing that you can do with pulses is to make them even shorter than what a specific laser can do. For instance, a typical laser amplifier used for micromachining or for spectroscopy has a pulse duration of around 30 femtoseconds, okay? So this has a lot of energy, but typically you cannot go below around 20, 30 femtoseconds. And why is that? Because you don't have enough spectrum. In order to have a short pulse, you need more spectrum. So a very important technique, which was devised also 25 years ago, roughly, in Italy, consists in taking your pulse, which is here, this red pulse, so it's a 30 femtosecond pulse, and then using the magic of nonlinear optics, increase its spectral content, so make its spectrum broader, okay? And this is something you can do if you have a sufficiently short pulse. So by making this pulse propagate in a hollow piece of glass, it's also called hollow fiber, filled with the gas, by propagation, the spectrum of the pulse will broaden. So you will end up with a spectrum which is broader than the initial spectrum, which means that you can compress the pulse to a shorter duration. And this is usually done using chirp mirrors. So in short, if you broaden the spectrum using nonlinear optics, which is something you can do if you have a sufficiently short pulse, then you can recompress the pulse and end up with really, really short pulses, which can be of a few femtoseconds in duration. And I will show you some of the results we can achieve nowadays using this technique. Now, the last part of my talk today has to do with pulse measurement. I mean, how can we know that we are doing such a short event if we cannot measure it using standard techniques? Well, you have to use, of course, other techniques other than using a photodiode and an oscilloscope in order to measure these pulses. So the important information here is to measure a pulse is to measure two pieces of information. One is its spectrum. In other words, which colors does the pulse have? And this can be done simply with a spectrometer. So there are devices to which you can send a pulse into them, and they will tell you how many colors you have, what's the spectrum of the pulse. So it's relatively easy to measure. However, you need another piece of information, which is the spectral phase. And this is the tricky bit. That's what's hard to measure, okay? And what I'm showing you here is what a pulse can look like in what we call the spectral domain, okay? So you have a spectrum, which is this black curve, and this spectrum tells you which different colors, so this is different colors or frequencies, and this is their amplitude. So the spectrum tells you which different colors make up the pulse, are inside the pulse. And now the spectral phase is this curve here in red, and what the spectral phase tells you is how each different color contributes to make the pulse. You may remember when I mentioned in the beginning that if you want to have a short pulse, you need different colors which have to be synchronized. So this is exactly what this phase is telling us. If we have, for instance, a phase which is a flat line, this means that all frequencies are synchronized, and we get a very, very short pulse. So once we have this information, the spectrum and the spectral phase, we can directly obtain the pulse in the time domain via an operation that we call the Fourier transform. So knowing spectrum and spectral phase gives you directly the pulse in the time domain without you having to measure the pulse directly in the time domain, which would be extremely hard to do because the pulses are extremely fast and you don't have a sufficiently fast detector. Now, two important aspects about the spectral phase. So first one, there is a very precise physical meaning to this spectral phase, which is its derivative gives you the arrival time of each frequency inside the spectrum. For instance, if this phase, which is shown here as a third order curve, if this was a parabola, or sorry, if it was a straight line, let's imagine it was a straight line. What's the derivative of a straight line? So it's a flat, it's 0. So you have a flat line, if you like. So this means that if the phase was a straight line, the arrival time of each frequency would be exactly the same. So we would have the shortest possible pulse. If you have a curve like this, its derivative is going to be a parabola. So this derivative is the arrival time. So you have different frequencies with different arrival times. So this means you don't have the shortest possible pulse. So you get the idea. Spectral phase, its derivative gives you the arrival time of each frequency inside the spectrum, and we want this arrival time to be the same for all frequencies. So we don't really want any curved phase. We want a flat and nice flat phase, which has a 0 derivative. Now, another thing, I mentioned dispersion many times and how dispersion affects the pulse. So when we look at the pulse in this picture, what dispersion does is really to change the spectral phase of the pulse, okay? And in particular, dispersion will introduce a quadratic phase, okay? I don't have time to go into details, but dispersion will change your ideal phase, which is a flat line, into a curved phase. And that's how you get the temporal broadening and so on. So traditionally, how did people measure pulses? They would usually use always 2 pulses, and I will show you why. So the first technique that came about to measure pulses was the following. Okay, the pulse is too fast to follow by itself. So why don't we just split the pulse in 2? We make a replica, and it's possible to do that. You can use a beam splitter, and which is shown here. So the pulse is coming here from above. We use a beam splitter, and we basically create 2 pulses. One is being reflected here, that's one, and the other one is transmitted. So we have 2 replicas of the same pulse. And now, if you build this carefully, you can introduce a delay between these 2 pulses. So essentially, the first technique used to measure pulses was based on creating a replica of a pulse, so 2 replicas if you like, and then using nonlinear optics to produce a signal which is proportional to the overlap of the pulses in time. Okay, this is something that you get with nonlinear optics. You can have a phenomenon which depends on the overlap, temporal overlap of the 2 pulses. So even though you cannot see each of the individual pulses, you can see when the 2 pulses are overlapped, because you can have a maximum signal, a maximum nonlinear signal in this situation. And this is shown here in these animations. You see one pulse here and the other pulse here. And as you change the delay between the 2 pulses, the green area is the overlap. So you get maximum overlap and maximum signal when the 2 pulses are overlapping. So that's basically what people did. So this is called autocorrelation. It gives you a signal which is maximum when the delay between the 2 pulses is minimum, 0, but it has a lot of limitations. So because of the way this works, you only have an estimate of the pulse duration. You're not looking at the direct pulse. You're looking at the convolution of the pulse. And also, unfortunately, you cannot get phase information. You know, the spectral phase, which is so important, you cannot really retrieve it from this kind of measurement. Mathematically, because this is an ill-posed problem. This autocorrelation is a 1D data set, and there is no solution for the phase retrieval problem in 1 dimension. Okay, so this was fixed almost 30 years ago with the introduction of a technique called frog. Okay? Frog is basically very similar to what we just saw, but instead of measuring the autocorrelation, the idea is to measure the spectrum of the autocorrelation. Okay, so instead of getting 1 line, you get a 2D data set called frog trace, which then, using an iterative numerical algorithm, enables you to find the spectral phase. So you make a measurement, which is the spectrum of an autocorrelation, and then you numerically retrieve the spectral phase. Now, one thing that I point out here is that we're still using 2 pulses, because frog is, if you look at the previous slide, This is an autocorrelator, splitting the pulse in two parts and mixing the two replicas. Here, in frog, you're doing the same, but now you're measuring the spectrum. But you need two pulses. So you split the pulse in two, manipulated the pulses, and then got the pulses together, okay? And the reason why you did this was because you're working in the time domain. And this forced you, because you were changing the delay between two pulses, you really needed two pulses. Now, another technique which arose a few years after, called Spider, is based on doing the following. So I'm not going to describe this in detail, but Spider also gives you the spectral phase, but works in a very different way. So it creates two pulse replicas, but in the spectral domain. So imagine you have your pulse with your spectrum, and now you create a replica of that pulse, which has a shifted spectrum, okay? You can do that using nonlinear optics. And if you do that, you have two pulses which are a replica of one another, and you can make them interfere in the spectral domain. From that interference, you can get the spectral phase, okay? So in short, in frog, you have two time-delayed replicas that you cross in a nonlinear medium, and in Spider, you create two spectrally shifted replicas of the pulse that you interfere to get the spectral phase. So you're always using two pulses all the time. But the issue here, and this is related to the technique I'm going to show you now, is do we really need two pulses? Now, it turns out we don't. And this is where the dispersion technique comes in. So whenever you have an experiment which uses a laser pulse from the left, and here the experiment is on the right, you're going to be needing a compressor in order to compensate the dispersion of optics of air itself and make sure that your pulse is going to be compressed at the end. And you always need a pulse compressor. Otherwise, you're going to have dispersion and your pulse is not going to be short anymore. Okay? Now, what we realized some years ago was that all you have to do to be able to measure the pulse is to take a small fraction of the pulse after the compressor and create a nonlinear signal. For instance, multiply its frequency in 2, a thing we call second harmonic, so changing red into blue, if you like, and do this as a function of dispersion. Not time, we don't use time here, but dispersion. So our compressor can be adjusted, so we adjust this compressor, and depending on the adjustment we make, the pulse goes from under compressed to maximum compressed, and then over compressed, if you like. And from this, we get a measurement, which is also a 2D trace, from which we can get the spectral phase of the pulse, okay? So compared to the techniques I just showed you, this is very simple because there are no time delays. I am not splitting the pulse. I'm just measuring a nonlinear signal as a function of dispersion, and furthermore, using a compressor that I would need anyway. So just to show you that this method is very sensitive, this is an animation that shows you what a dscan trace, so this measurement of the spectrum of a nonlinear signal as a function of dispersion, what it would look like if the pulse had a very nice spectrum, which is a Gaussian spectrum, but had a bit of a crazy phase. So you see each phase gives you a very different pulse. This is the pulse in the time domain. And we see here that our measurement, the dscan trace, is also very different. So dscan traces encode phase information and are very sensitive to changes in the spectral phase, which is the tricky bit that we want to know, okay? And they're also very intuitive. So when you do this kind of measurement, it's like you were looking inside the pulse without having to have a sufficiently fast time resolution. So to make a long story short, a dscan trace of a really short pulse will be very thin. So this is dispersion again, and this is spectrum. So it will be thin and flat. Flat, which means the phase is flat, and thin, which means the pulse compresses and decompresses very, very rapidly. So it's a short pulse, okay? And the question is, okay, this is a measurement we can do. It's a spectral measurement as a function of dispersion, no problem. But we really obtain the phase of the pulses from this measurement, and the answer is yes. And that's what the dscan algorithm does. You start with the measurement of the dscan trace, and then use an algorithm to essentially guess which phase will give you the trace that you have just measured. And I'm going to show you this to you very rapidly. So this is a retrieval, a numerical retrieval of an actually measured trace. So this is a measurement of an extremely short pulse, around 3 femtoseconds in duration. And the algorithm will start by calculating the phase. So this is the spectrum, very broad spectrum, but we don't know the spectral phase. We just know the spectrum, and we know this measurement of the dscan trace. So the algorithm will try to guess which phase gives you this trace. And I'm going to run that now, and that's it. It takes less than 1 second. So the algorithm was able to retrieve the spectral phase, which is this red line, and you see that the numerical retrieval and the measurement are the same. Okay, so that's basically how dscan works. And we have the pulse in the time domain. So I'm going to give you now a couple of examples of extremely short light sources, which are based on dscan. So this is a source we developed in Porto a few years ago, and it's based on using an ultrafast amplifier, which has a duration of around 30 femtoseconds, so very short, but not sufficiently short for certain applications like spectroscopy of really fast processes. So in order for us to go from 30 femtoseconds to 3 femtoseconds, we had to broaden the spectrum of our laser. So this is a photo of the laser system, the 30 femtosecond laser system. And then we coupled the pulses into a hollow fiber. You remember I mentioned that you can make light propagate inside a hollow fiber filled with a noble gas. And in propagation, the spectrum will broaden. So you see here, this is a photo in the lab where the light, as it propagates, it acquires new colors. So at the output, the light beam will look like a white light beam. It's like a white laser. And here you see this is a spectrum. The spectrum of this laser, you see it's really broadband. It goes from the ultraviolet to the infrared. So it looks like white light to us. And then we compress this using chirp mirrors, special chirp mirrors. And this is an image. This is from a more recent result where we obtained, as far as we know, the shortest optical pulse ever produced and measured using an optical technique. So this pulse, this is a measurement, dscan measurement, this is the retrieval, the spectrum is here, so very broadband, you see, this is from the 400 nanometers up to more than 1000, so it's white light and more, and in the time domain, it's a really, really short pulse with only 2.2 femtoseconds. And more importantly, this is a single cycle pulse. It only includes one single oscillation of light, okay? And this is very important for applications such as attosecond science, which unfortunately I don't have time to talk about today, okay? So this is an important example of how dispersion, when properly used, enables you to measure as well as to compress pulses down to unprecedentedly short durations. So, in short, to summarize this talk, I hope to have convinced you that femtosecond laser pulses today are really indispensable tools for many applications in science and technology, from research, fundamental research in physics, chemistry, biology, to applications such as micromachining and biomedical imaging. However, these pulses have very broad spectra, and so you have to be very careful when you use them in any application, especially because of dispersion. And dispersion, even though it can be a problem, is also a very important tool because it enables you to manipulate the pulse. So we saw how the technique of CPA, which was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, enables you to generate the highest powers ever on Earth. It's also important for measuring and controlling pulses, for instance, using the dispersion scan technique, where the only parameter you're changing is really dispersion, so you're not playing with time. And finally, I showed you how dispersion scan has enabled you to generate some of the shortest optical pulses ever produced down to true single cycle durations. So a light pulse, which is just a single oscillation of light. Okay, so with this, I would like to conclude this presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it. And I finished with an overview of our lab in Porto, where you can see our students working in several experiments, which we have running right now. Thank you very much. So I believe we have, I don't know if we have questions. now, but I believe until 2 p.m. it should be for questions. Or perhaps you would like to use the chat. Hello?